They forced her to marry a caged monkey until a quiet man said she wasn't born for shame. The sun hung heavy over Perdition's bluff, pressing down on the earth like judgment itself. The town sat quiet, scorched and waiting, tucked between red canyons that loomed like ancient gods with no more mercy to give. Dust rolled through the empty streets in lazy eddies, whispering against saloon walls and warped church doors. Nothing in Perdition's bluff ever moved too fast, except cruelty and maybe fate. It was a forgotten town, left off most maps and all prayers, and those who stayed learned long ago that silence was safer than hope. Folks didn't speak much unless they had to, and when they did it soft and sideways. There were stories about the Brody clan, about the rituals and punishments they handed down from the big house on the hill. No court had power there. No preacher dared speak against them. The Brodus were the law, and their laws were strange. Everyone knew what day it was. A lean boy had ridden through at dawn ringing a cracked bell, and now the whole town gathered in the square, not because they wanted to, but because they were expected. Children were pulled by the hand. Old men wiped sweat from their brows and pretended not to shake. At the edge of the crowd, the sheriff stood like a man carved from wood, badge dull and boots polished for nothing. He didn't meet anyone's eyes. From the balcony of the old bank, Harlan Brody stepped forward, arms wide like a showman. His coat was lined with silver buttons, his boots clean despite the dust. His voice rang sharp across the square. "Today," he called, "we celebrate obedience. We remind ourselves what happens to those who forget their place, and we give thanks for the order that keeps our little town from tearing itself apart." People didn't cheer. They didn't speak. Some lowered their eyes. Others stared into the horizon, wishing themselves far away. Behind Harlan, the doors of the bank opened. Two of his sons dragged out a crude wooden altar, made of cracked planks and hung with white lace. On top of it sat a large iron cage. Inside the cage, pacing, was a chimpanzee dressed in a small black suit. It snarled and hissed, jerking at the bars as if it understood the cruelty it was made part of. Then came Josephine Mercy. She was led by the youngest Brody, a boy barely grown but already carrying his father's smile, too wide, too cold. Joe didn't speak. She never did. Not since the day her father was shot in front of her eyes, and the Brodus took her in under the pretense of guardianship. She wore a wedding dress that had once belonged to Harlan's late wife, stained and yellow with age, the hem dragging in the dust. A veil covered her face, but not her shame. She did not cry. Her back was straight. Her eyes were dry. But every step she took toward that cage rang louder than the bell that had summoned the town. The crowd watched. Not one person stepped forward. Not the pastor. Not the sheriff. Not the old woman who once rocked Joe to sleep as a babe. Everyone was waiting for it to be over. Somewhere near the edge of the square, a man stood alone. He was tall and lean, the kind of figure that towns remember only after the story's done. Dust clung to his coat, and his wide-brimmed hat shaded most of his face. His hands rested on his belt, close to the hips, not tense but ready. His eyes, dark and unreadable, never left Joe. When the Brody boy tried to force her to kneel beside the cage, those eyes narrowed. But the man said nothing. Not yet. The preacher stepped forward with a torn book in his trembling hands, and Harlan grinned. "Do it proper," he said. "We're all civilized folks here." The preacher opened the book, but his voice cracked. He looked at Joe, then at the chimp. He faltered. Harlan grabbed the book, tossed it aside, and shouted, "By my name and by the law of this town, I bind this woman to this beast. In defiance, she finds her place. In obedience, she earns her mercy." There was a long silence. The chimpanzee screamed. Joe knelt. A dry wind cut through the square. Dust rose in brief spirals. Somewhere, a horse pawed the ground nervously. And from the back of the crowd, so low it was barely a breath against the wind, the quiet man finally spoke. "She wasn't born for shame," he said. No one heard him, but he kept watching. The stranger arrived at dusk, riding a quiet horse and wearing dust like a second skin. He didn't speak when he dismounted, nor when he handed over the reins to a stable boy with a nod. He walked with a purpose too slow to be hunted, too certain to be lost. He pushed through the swinging doors of the Last Light Saloon, a crooked two-story place where the whiskey came warm and the air stank of old sweat and fresh fear. Behind the bar stood Otis Granger, the saloon-keeper and a blind veteran who'd lost his sight to grape shot at Shiloh and never once spoke of regret. Otis sniffed the air when the door creaked open. "You're not from here," he said flatly, polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. "But you smell like somebody who remembers things." The stranger set a single silver coin on the counter. "Room for the week," he said. "You might not want to stay that long." "Don't intend to." Otis slid a brass key across the counter without asking a name. "Upstairs. Second door. Don't lean on the railing, it bites." The man nodded once, pocketed the key, and climbed the stairs. By the time the sun rose, speculation had already spread through Perdition's Bluff like a brush fire in August. A stranger was news, and in a town ruled by silence, rumor was the only language anyone still dared speak. "Bounty hunter," said the barber, looking up from a customer's stubbled jaw. "Come to collect on Brody blood." "Fugitive," muttered the banker, squinting through his spectacles. "Watch how he don't carry no papers. Men like that are always running." "He's a preacher," said the seamstress, who'd seen the stranger pause before the chapel and remove his hat, even though the doors were bolted and the cross long torn down. Whoever he was, he made no effort to explain himself. He moved through town like a shadow that had chosen to stay, helping when it was needed and vanishing when it wasn't. He stopped once to help a boy struggling to lift a wagon wheel. With steady hands and no wasted motion, he lifted, aligned, and hammered the axle back into place. When the boy stammered out a thank you, the man only tipped his hat and walked on. Later, at sundown, he found old Farmer Amos slumped outside the saloon, too drunk to rise, but too proud to beg. The stranger eased him to his feet with a quiet word, dusted off his coat, and walked him home without fanfare. Amos never said what was spoken on that walk, but he never touched a bottle again. Still, no one knew who he was. In his rented room above the saloon, the stranger opened a small leather pouch and emptied its contents on the bedside table. A frayed photograph of a woman and child, a single dried rose, and a tarnished U.S. Marshal badge with a broken clasp. He stared at the badge for a long while, then placed it beside the window, where the morning light would find it, but the town would not. Across the bluff, in the big house on the hill, Joe Mercy sat in a locked room that used to be a pantry. It had no more comforts than a jail, and the only window looked out on the Brodus back courtyard. That's where they kept the chimp. The animal lived better than she did. Fresh water in a porcelain bowl, meat and fruit on a silver tray. Servants mocked Joe by dressing it in fine clothes and teaching it tricks. One of the Brody sons called it Mr. Husband and made a show of bowing whenever it screeched. Joe watched all of it with a blank expression, but behind her silence burned a slow fury. Word came through the house that the town was preparing for the Harvest Festival. Harlan Brody intended to parade Joe through the square again, arm in arm with the beast, as a symbol of what happened to traitors, to women who dared speak, to bloodlines the Brodus wanted erased. She did not scream. She did not cry, but her fists clenched every time they rehearsed her part. In town, preparations began. Streamers were nailed to cracked windows. Banners hung limp in the heat. Musicians tuned old fiddles that hadn't played a joyful note in years. In the general store, the stranger stood quietly beside a shelf of canned beans, his eyes following a little girl dragging a broken doll. The shopkeeper cleared his throat. "Can I help you find something, sir?" The stranger turned, his gaze flat and distant. The soul of a town dies with every silence. The shopkeeper blinked. "Beg pardon." But the stranger was already walking out. Otis heard the boots returning up the stairs that night and said nothing. He just reached under the bar and poured a glass of the good whiskey, the kind he usually kept hidden for funerals or confessions. "You planning to stay till the festival?" he asked the air. There was no reply, only the creak of floorboards overhead and the quiet sound of a man sitting down. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust, rust, and something older. Something coming. And in a room lit only by the dying sun, a stranger watched the sky change and waited. The morning of the harvest festival broke hot and still, the kind of heat that sat in a man's bones and turned sweat sour. A wind moved now and then, but it didn't bring relief, only stirred the dust until it settled in the creases of shirts and the corners of eyes. The people of Perdition's Bluff emerged from their homes slowly, dressed in the cleanest rags they owned, pressed forward not by joy, but by expectation. The town square had been decorated with forced cheer. Faded banners stretched from rooftop to rooftop. A rusted bandstand stood in the center, decked in wilted flowers and with freshly painted to hide rot. Paper lanterns hung from window frames, their colors leached by the sun before the day even began. Children ran in loose groups, drawn by music and movement, but even their laughter carried an edge, uncertain and hollow. A string quartet played from the steps of the old courthouse, sour notes plucked by trembling fingers. The sheriff stood at the base of the platform, one hand resting on the butt of his revolver, the other on the brim of his hat, eyes scanning the crowd with no intention of seeing. The Brodus arrived late. Their carriage was black lacquer, pulled by two white horses that had once belonged to the governor. Harlan Brody stood tall in the open seat, dressed in dark velvet, with a silver chain across his chest. His sons followed behind, riding on horseback in pairs, grinning like men who believed themselves invincible. But it was Jo the crowd waited for. She stepped from the carriage, flanked by two Brody guards. Her dress was the same tattered lace from the wedding, a mockery of beauty, yellowed and torn. A bruise darkened her left cheekbone, and her lip bore a thin, scabbed cut. But she walked with her back straight, hands bound in front of her with white ribbon that might have once been silk. The chimpanzee came next, dragged in a wheeled cage. It wore a red waistcoat and a top hat, its teeth bared in a constant snarl. The Brodus had trained it to wave, and it did, lifting its hairy arm and flailing to the sound of scattered, hesitant clapping. Jo didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes ahead, jaw clenched. Her silence was no longer survival, it was resistance. Harlan Brody raised his arms as he reached the center of the square. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "today we celebrate the harvest. But more than that, we celebrate peace, order, the keeping of traditions that make this town safe and whole." He gestured toward Jo. "This woman, whose family once brought chaos to our doors, now stands where she belongs, beside the law we've chosen." The sheriff gave a slow, approving nod. A few people clapped. Most looked away. At the back of the crowd, near the church's broken steps, the stranger stood. Same hat, same coat, hands near his hips, motionless except for the slow tapping of his thumb against his belt. No one knew his name. No one had dared ask. But they saw the way he watched the square, saw the weight of his stare on the Brodus, and the strange calm that settled around him like smoke before a fire. The festival continued. Vendors handed out stale biscuits and undercooked meat. Musicians played louder, masking the tension. Children weaved through legs with paper fans and dust-coated shoes. And then it happened. The chimpanzee, agitated by a thrown rock or the heat or its own nature, lunged forward in its cage. Its long arms shot through the bars and grabbed at a passing child. The girl screamed and stumbled back, her dress tearing as she fell. The cage shook. The animal shrieked. Panic rippled through the square. Harlan waved a hand. "Calm now. It's just excitement. He's a groom eager to see his bride." Laughter followed, ugly, forced, and thin. One of the Brody sons stepped up beside Jo, pulled her roughly toward the cage. "You going to kiss your husband in front of the good people? Or do we have to train you too?" The laughter grew louder. Jo didn't flinch, but her eyes, cold and unwavering, found something past the crowd. They settled on a single figure at the edge of the square. The stranger stepped forward. Not quickly, not with a shout, just one foot in front of the other, slow and sure, until the noise fell to a hush. The music stopped. Conversations died midward. The sheriff turned but didn't move. The Brody son holding Jo narrowed his eyes. "You got a problem, mister?" The stranger's voice carried easily, steady and deep. She wasn't born for shame. The words hit like thunder, not loud but final. The kind of thing you don't answer unless you're ready to draw blood. Harlan Brody stared down from the platform. "And who in God's name are you?" The stranger lifted his head. For the first time, the crowd saw his face, sun-worn, shadowed, with a scar beneath his left eye and eyes like old glass. He reached into his coat and pulled something out, a tarnished badge. He held it up just long enough for the meaning to settle, then let it drop to the ground. "I'm the man who buried the law you killed." The silence that followed was absolute. Jo breathed in slowly, her hands tightening at her sides. The sheriff swallowed but didn't speak. Harlan laughed, one short, disbelieving bark. "You're a ghost, then." The stranger stepped closer. "No, I'm the reckoning." The people of Perdition's Bluff did not cheer. They did not cry out. But one by one, they turned to look not at the Brodus, but at him, the man with no name, the man who'd spoken the truth they'd buried in fear. Something was coming, and this time the town might not look away. 10 years ago, a town named Red Hollow burned under moonlight. The Brody clan rode in just after dusk, 50 men on horseback, faces covered, guns hot. They came for gold and blood, but mostly for revenge. Someone had stood against Harlan Brody's claim on a silver mine, and the law sided with justice instead of fear. That someone was Marshal Ezra Cole. He was younger then, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed, a man people trusted just by watching how he moved. He carried a colt on each hip, and the weight of the badge, like it meant something holy. His wife, Clara, waited for him on the edge of town in a small house with white curtains. She kept a rose garden behind the porch and always lit a lamp in the window before bed. She died in that house when the Brodus set it aflame, and the rose garden died with her. Ezra arrived too late. All that remained was char, a wedding ring curled black with heat, and the screams of a town that wouldn't forget. He buried her with no words, no preacher. He set his badge at the foot of the grave and walked west, into desert and silence. For a long time, he was no one. He drifted from town to town, working odd jobs, never staying long. But wherever he passed, he listened to stories, rumors, whispers of a family growing crueler by the year, unchecked, unchallenged. Then he heard about the girl, about the wedding, about the monkey in a cage. So he came back. Now he stood in Perdition's Bluff, hat low, boots planted in the center of the square, with the wind teasing the edge of his duster. Around him, time held its breath. The Brodus reached first. Gun barrels rose like iron thorns from half a dozen holsters. Ezra moved before the first shout, sidestepping, drawing, firing. One Brody son fell with a cry and a spray of dirt beside him. The second caught a bullet in the thigh and collapsed behind a hay cart. Chaos broke. People screamed and scattered. Horses shrieked. Jo ducked, the chain binding her wrists snagging on a nail as she fell behind the cage. 3 more gunmen surged forward from behind the carriage. Ezra dropped to one knee and fired twice. One fell instantly. The other took a shot to the shoulder and slammed into the church steps. The last hesitated, just long enough for a farmer to lunge from the crowd with a pitchfork. Steel met flesh with a grunt, and the Brody enforcer went down hard. The townsfolk were moving now, not running, rising. The blacksmith dragged a chain across the saloon doors and bolted them shut. A mother grabbed her daughter and shielded her with her body, but did not flee. The old schoolteacher knelt beside a wounded boy and began to pray, then picked up the boy's rifle. Harlan Brody stood unmoved on the bandstand, fury swelling in his chest like a sickness. His face twisted as he drew his weapon and pointed it straight at Ezra. "You come back from hell just to die here?" he roared. Ezra didn't answer. He was already moving. The two met at the foot of the stand. Harlan fired. The bullet tore through Ezra's left shoulder and spun him sideways, but he didn't fall. His right hand struck out like lightning, knocking the revolver from Harlan's grip. It clattered to the boards, forgotten. The two men collided, grappling. Fists thudded against bone. Blood smeared the wood. Ezra's breath came ragged, and Harlan's strength, born from years of domination, pressed hard and fast. But Ezra fought with something older, loss that had never been answered. They stumbled backward into the stand support beam. Jo watched, hand still bound, searching for anything she could use. Her eyes locked on the ribbon, white and ragged, dragging behind her. The wedding chain. She pulled it free from the nail, wrapped it once around her fist, and stood. Harlan had Ezra by the throat now, pressing him hard against the rail. Ezra's vision blurred. His knees buckled. The crowd was shouting, but distant, like voices in water. Then came a sharp whistle. Harlan turned his head, just enough. Joe threw the chain. It struck Harlan across the temple with a sickening crack, the metal links glinting like justice in the sunlight. He staggered. Ezra surged forward and delivered one last blow, straight to the jaw. Harlan Brody collapsed, unconscious, his head landing inches from the caged chimpanzee. The square went silent. The wind stopped. And then, slowly, a cheer rose, not loud, not wild, but certain. A cheer that started with a single voice and spread like fire through dry grass. Ezra sank to one knee, holding his wounded shoulder. Joe moved to his side, using the wedding chain to wrap and bind the bleeding. She didn't speak, but her hands were steady. The sheriff approached at last, looking older than he had an hour ago. "You want your badge back?" he asked, voice brittle. Ezra looked at the man, then at the crushed star still lying in the dirt beside the bandstand. "No," he said. "I came to bury it." Behind them, the Brody men who still breathed were being disarmed by townsfolk. One by one, the weapons that had ruled the bluff for a decade clattered to the earth. Ezra stood slowly, shoulder burning. He looked across the square, saw the people he'd once sworn to protect, not cowering, not silent, but standing. He met Joe's eyes. She nodded once, then turned toward the cage. She reached for the latch, hesitated, then opened it wide. The chimp stepped out, confused, blinking into the sunlight. No one clapped. No one mocked. The animal walked into the crowd and vanished. Ezra looked down at Harlan's unconscious form, then to Joe. "What now?" Joe's voice came soft, hoarse from disuse. "We cleaned the rot." And for the first time in a decade, Perdition's Bluff breathed freely. Dawn came gentle to Perdition's Bluff, for the first time in years. The sun rose not like a burden but like a promise, soft gold slipping over the canyon rims and brushing the town awake. Smoke no longer curled from rooftops in fear. The silence that followed the storm had changed. It was no longer the hush of dread, but of peace settling in unfamiliar bones. Ezra Cole stood in the town square as light touched the blood-dark wood of the bandstand. His left arm was bound tight in a sling, his coat hanging open, the tarnished badge he'd once buried now tucked into his saddlebag, not to wear, but to carry. Joe stood beside him, free of ribbon and chain. Her face was bruised, but her spine was straight. She looked at the morning the way a prisoner looks at open sky. Ezra turned toward her. He didn't speak. He never had to. Her voice was quiet, rasped with disuse but certain. "Thank you." Ezra dipped his head once. That was enough. By midday, the sheriff gathered his things, an old Bible, a polished six-shooter he never fired, and the badge that no longer meant anything. He left it on the step of the jail, then walked out of town without a backward glance. Otis Granger, blind behind the bar of the Last Light Saloon, raised his glass toward no one in particular. "We're reborn," he said, his voice steady. "Lord, help us learn to live like it." The people didn't celebrate, not loudly. There were no parades, no music, but they moved differently now. Heads lifted, voices returned. Old men spoke to children again, and women unlocked doors they'd kept bolted for years. The Brody estate was seized. The men who remained loyal to Harlan were marched out of town under watchful eyes and loaded rifles. The house on the hill was stripped clean and burned down to the bones, its smoke rising into a clear blue sky, as if the earth itself was exhaling something long held in. When the townspeople offered Ezra the marshal's badge again, he turned it over in his good hand, thumb brushing the edges. Then he handed it back. "Justice isn't a job," he said. "It's a promise." He left it lying on the church altar, resting there like an oath fulfilled. Joe returned to the edge of town, to the remnants of the Mercy homestead. What was left stood crooked and half sunk in the dirt. The well was dry. The windows were glassless, but the foundation was strong. Ezra showed up the next day without a word, hammer and nail slung over his good shoulder. He worked beside her in silence. Joe didn't question it. They didn't speak of what came next. Some days they worked until sunset, rebuilding one board at a time. Others, they just sat on the stoop, watching the canyon light move like breath across the land. One afternoon, a traveling circus came through on its way to California. They stopped for water, saw the chimpanzee in the old Brody cage, and asked no questions. Joe watched as they loaded the animal into a padded crate, this time with care. The ringmaster tipped his hat to her, then to Ezra, before snapping the reins and rolling on. The cage stood empty in the yard for a week before Joe took an axe to it and burned what remained. The fire crackled into the night, and Ezra sat beside her without a word. He left 2 days later. No ceremony, no goodbye, just a horse, a satchel, and the wind at his back. Joe found his room and the saloon cleared, except for a single item resting on the windowsill. A pressed rose, brown with age but intact. A child saw him ride out at first light. A girl, maybe 8, barefoot and wide-eyed. She ran to Joe's porch and tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Joe," she said, pointing toward the rising dust on the trail. Was he a hero? Joe looked out at the horizon. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something deep, grief, gratitude, and something stronger than both. She smiled. He was the silence before thunder. And that was enough. Ezra Cole was never seen in Perdition's Bluff again, but his story remained. Men told it in saloons from Tombstone to El Paso, about the quiet rider who came with no name, who took down a family feared by all, who never raised his voice but changed everything. Some said he was an angel. Others said he was death in a borrowed coat. But Joe knew better. He was justice, come late but not empty. And the town that once bowed to shame now whispered only legends of the quiet rider who came when they needed him most.